I am very pleased to introduce our speaker. Just for a second, though, if you worked at Southampton College as a staff or faculty member, would you just raise your hand? Southampton College? Wow, thank you so much for coming tonight. Amber started her career as an undergraduate at Southampton College and then transferred over to Stony Brook to finish her degree. She then worked as a lab tech in my lab for almost a year. She very much wanted to go to Florida State University, but I wooed her away from that with the promise that she could do her graduate work in tropical systems. Amber then spent a very varied career in her graduate program. She served on the governor's task force for the seagrass. She was part of developing the first legislation to protect seagrass in the state of New York. She did a series of experiments looking at multiple stressors on seagrasses. All of this had nothing to do with what she went on to do for her dissertation. She began working in Jamaica, looking at recruitment on kind of anthropogenic effects on recruitment of coral reef organisms. And it was during that time that she became very interested in the role of ocean acidification and the impacts that it has really on species interactions. And so I'm really happy and very proud to invite Amber to come up and share with us the stuff that she has for tonight.
Okay, well, thank you, Brad, for that introduction. And also thank all of you guys for actually coming out on this beautiful Friday evening. Special thanks to my students from my oceanography class who managed to come out and hear me speak for the third time this week. Okay, so today I'll be talking about a topic that's obviously very near and dear to my heart, and that's how ocean acidification is impacting coral reefs. Now, hopefully you guys have at some point had the opportunity to see a coral reef, experience it firsthand. But if you haven't, these sorts of images here probably come to your mind whenever you think of a reef. We generally think of them as very beautiful, often pristine, full of fish and other life. And images like these are sort of what we picture when we conjure images in our mind. Although reefs are very beautiful and very diverse and just a general wonderful habitat, they also provide some very valuable services to the world. Many of you may think of reefs as beautiful, so obviously there's the beautiful aspect of reefs. However, reefs also provide an economic value to many countries around the world. This chart, which is a little bit cut off, I apologize, is showing the value of coral reefs as pertains to different aspects of the reef that it's providing a service. So the fisheries, the coastal protection or coastline protection, the general tourism and recreational appeal of coral reefs, the biodiversity value and the different aspects of the organisms that we can utilize from reefs, and then the total dollar value of reefs in these different regions, from anywhere from Southeast Asia to Australia. Now, these dollar values look kind of small, but they are in millions of dollars, right? So if we highlight the U.S. here, we are over $1 billion annually that we receive to our economy from coral reefs in some way, shape, or form. Now, obviously, there are many countries around the world that have very few other economic input except for things like tourism and fisheries. So if we boil this down not to numbers, but into proportion dependency on reefs, we have this map of the globe here, and these different colors are representing the social and economic importance of reefs, or the dependency of these countries on reefs around the world. These lighter colors are low dependency, and then the darker purple are very high. So what you should first notice here is that most of the Pacific nations, particularly the island nations, are extremely dependent on coral reefs as a whole, as well as many of the Caribbean nations. So this should really sort of impart the value of coral reefs, not in a monetary value, but rather as a social and economic value for these whole nations. Now, even countries that don't have as much dependency on coral reefs, like the US and Australia, they have other aspects of their economy they can rely on. Coral reefs are still extremely valuable to the land itself. So Australia, this is a little inset of Australia here. This is the Great Barrier Reef, which spans thousands of miles. One of the main services of this reef to the people living in Australia, obviously is tourism and other aspects, but it's mere storm protection, because what happens is when waves start to approach the land, most of the energy gets dissipated by these reefs. So that once the waves pass this reef area, the waves actually impacting the coastline where people living have greatly reduced the energy and also wave height. In fact, as an average, we see a 97% reduction in wave energy and an 84% reduction in wave height as these storm surges start to move onto land. Now, these are very similar in sort of coastline protection as our barrier reefs on Long Island, and I think we can all imagine what would have happened if Sandy had hit and there hadn't have been barrier islands here. So whether or not the countries depend solely on these reefs for their economic value or not, they're still gaining some value from them. So as humans, we always like to kind of think about how things benefit us. So that's not always the most important aspect of a habitat, though. One of the main reasons coral reefs are important is the sheer amount of biodiversity and organisms that it supports. These are just a handful, really the most charismatic and colorful that I could find in my library. These are some of the organisms that rely on coral reefs. And while these are not the only organisms, certainly, there's a very, very large amount that do. In fact, coral reefs are often called the rainforests of the sea because they have so many endemic species living in them. Now, one of the main reasons corals can support all of these organisms and provide this shoreline protection and support thousands and thousands of millions of dollars worth of fisheries is because of the structure that the corals themselves have. So here's a picture of 5 different species and growth forms of coral. And you can see that there's a lot of different forms. There's these branching forms, also the little stubby, nubby ones here, more solid forms. All of these are made from calcium carbonate or limestone, so they're solid rock. And the corals, as they grow, are laying down more and more of this calcium carbonate. So a very, very small coral, over its time and throughout its lifetime, is going to grow larger and larger, and it's going to create these forms. That is what we think of the foundation of coral reefs. And this is, I'm probably going to end up referring to it as calcium carbonate just because it's my jargon and I always do it. But this is the same material that limestone is made out of. So if you think of calcium carbonate, it's the same as limestone. This is also the same material that scallops and clams, oysters, and mussels make their shells out of. Okay, so how many of you have been walking on the beach and seen some sort of clam or oyster shell that looks like this? Raise your hand, right? So most of you guys at some point have seen this. How many of you can tell me what does that? Boring sponge. Oh, somebody's been to one of my lectures or knows me. So all these little holes are caused by a boring sponge. This is something called bioerosion. It's a process where, some sort of animal, oftentimes a sponge, removes the limestone material itself from these organisms. So in the case of these clams, we have oftentimes sponges around the local area. Coral reefs, which are also made of limestone, have a very large amount of bioeroders that are removing the limestone from their structure. So there are fish, there are parrotfish that as they eat the coral, they're breaking down parts of the structure beneath the animal itself. We have worms that will grow into the coral, and as they grow inside of it, remove some of the skeleton. There's also boring sponges, which you'll probably be very tired of hearing of by the end of the night. And then we have urchins, which will remove the limestone as they sort of make their little holes. And also we have things called microborers, which is sort of a suite of organisms, things like algae, bacteria, fungi, that are slowly eroding the skeleton of corals. When we look at bioerosion, this is a picture of a coral head here. You can see there's a little urchin hiding under here. Bioerosion by urchins tends to result in something that looks like this. As they start to really dig in and make their little homes, they will remove a very large proportion of the skeleton. and end up with something that looks kind of like this mushroom cloud here. But believe it or not, these urchins are not the main bioeroder of coral reefs. Sponges are actually a much more devastating bioeroder as a whole. So this coral head here, all these little like tiny orange pock marks here are a sponge. And while it looks like, oh, the bioerosion in this coral isn't nearly as bad as the one that you just showed me right here, if we were to cut open this coral head, we would probably find something like this, where it's internally it's hollow from the sponge living inside. Because these sponges, their job in life is to hide from being eaten by fish and other things. So what they do so that they don't get eaten is burrow into these coral heads, live internally, and only a very small portion of them is exposed. So this way they're not eaten by fish and other things. Here's another photo. This is a branching coral that I collected in Panama. This orange bit here is a boring sponge. And if you were to put this coral in bleach, which I don't recommend, I'm just saying, you would see that what's left behind is this skeleton here, held together partially by this sponge. But as you can imagine, this coral that's eaten by sponge internally is not going to be very structurally sound. It's going to be very weak. Where there was once a hard, solid foundation, it's sort of riddled with this sponge that makes it much less sturdy. So I don't want to give you guys the wrong impression. Bioerosion is not bad. Bioerosion is a natural part of coral reefs. In fact, it's very important. It helps to recycle minerals on the reef. It also frees up space. So if you have a coral that's starting to die, oftentimes you'll have bioeroders come in, it breaks it down, and now there's more space for other animals to come in and use. So by no means am I saying that bioerosion is unhealthy. Bioerosion will always be healthy for reefs as long as coral growth is greater than bioerosion. You'll have a healthy reef. So in a perfect scenario, corals will grow faster than sponges or other bioeroders will be removing. Simple economics. If you have more growth than you have removal, you're in good shape. You're a healthy reef. Because, of course, growing corals are healthy corals. Now, hopefully, you guys are all aware in some way, shape, or form that our reefs are threatened by various human activities for the most part. Things like physical damage from boats or divers, careless snorkelers on vacation, destructive fishing practices like dynamite fishing or careless fishing, discarding of the various fishing materials. Nutrient loading, where we're increasing the amount of nutrients on the reef, and so we have high algal growth. Poor water quality kind of goes hand in hand with that. Sedimentation, as we start to build on our coastlines, the more sediment and other dirt gets deposited on the reefs, the harder it is for these guys to grow. And of course, there's the ever-present temperature rise and ocean acidification. And these are the two threats that I'm going to be focusing on today, because all these other threats can be very localized. What I mean by that is one reef can have physical damage as a problem. Maybe there's a hotel being built and destroying part of the reef, whereas another reef can be perfectly unimpacted. However, with temperature rise and ocean acidification, it's a global threat that's impacting all reefs. Granted, there are varying degrees that it can impact those reefs, but no reef is safe from these two things. And unfortunately, ocean acidification is going to start tipping the balance because it decreases coral growth. So as we decrease the coral growth, perhaps we're going to see an increase in bioerosion. So before I kind of launch into the meat of my talk, I'm going to take a sip of water. And then I'm going to ask you, do you know what ocean acidification is? The answer is probably no, but more importantly than knowing what it is, you really need to know why it is. So carbon dioxide, it's a natural part of the Earth's air, right? It's a component of all the atmospheric air that we're breathing right now. It itself is not dangerous. It's simply a carbon and two oxygens. No harm, no foul there. In fact, it's necessary so that plants are able to photosynthesize. Plants take carbon dioxide, turn it into sugars for themselves to eat, and release oxygen as a byproduct. Thankfully, we ourselves breathe oxygen, so we can thank plants and CO2 for that. And we sort of do the opposite process as we breathe. We take in oxygen and release CO2. CO2 in general is increasing in the atmosphere. And largely this is because humans have come onto the Earth and sort of upset the balance between the natural carbon system. So we are now taking carbon that was meant to be stored deep within the Earth, things like dinosaurs. Sorry, we're not taking dinosaurs. Things like coal and other fossil fuels. And we're bringing those from deep within the Earth and burning them as our fuel. And as we burn those fossil fuels, that carbon gets released as carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Other issues that are sort of human-induced that's upsetting this balance and increasing CO2 is deforestation. I just told you that plants photosynthesize. They reduce the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. But when we tear down trees and forests to create industry and other aspects of really human living, we're removing that service because this is not really going to provide any sort of photosynthetic benefit to us. So I'm going to show you this very complicated graph, or diagram rather, of the carbon cycle. So this is summing up in one very complicated, lots of words sort of way, the carbon that's coming in, carbon dioxide coming into Earth and going out. So for the most part, I want you to notice these arrows. You see that plants are drawing down carbon dioxide. They're reducing the CO2 in the air. Whereas we also have respiration and microbial decomposition. That's releasing CO2 back into the atmosphere. So you see that this one's going down, this one's going up. For the most part, they're in balance. Here in the ocean, we see the ocean is absorbing CO2, but also releasing CO2 in the air-sea gas exchange. And just like on land with the photosynthesis, we have phytoplankton photosynthesizing in the ocean, also dying and re-releasing it back up. So if this were just what was going on, these little white arrows here, carbon dioxide would not be increasing significantly in the atmosphere. However, what you may have noticed I skipped over is this little red section here that's labeled the fossil fuel, cement, and land use change. And that's because this is a result of us taking this fossil pool down here, where we have stored carbon reserves, and rather than letting it sit here for millions of years like it was intended to do, we're bringing it back up, burning it, and adding CO2 to the atmosphere. So this is why CO2 is increasing. This is a graph since the 1960s, so this is the last 50 years. I took the liberty of looking up what our current CO2 is and adding on to the graph so we're current to date. What you should notice is there's a very large increase in the amount of CO2 in our atmosphere, increasing from about 315 parts per million to just 400 as of Tuesday when I put that up there. Now what you should also hopefully notice in this graph is there's this nice red line, which is the average, but you also see these tiny little oscillations. And if you're wondering what those oscillations are, well, that's why I'm here. We have these annual cycles from seasonal differences in CO2. So in October, the end of the summer, the end of the spring, for the past 5 months or so, we've had all the trees in the northern hemisphere doing their thing, right? They're all green, they're all photosynthesizing. They're sucking up as much CO2 as possible. So in October, we get the lowest CO2 values that we will see on Earth every October for that year. And then in April, or sometime around the very tail end of winter, just before everything starts blooming, we see the highest value because, of course, for the past couple months during the winter time, no photosynthesis has been happening in the northern hemisphere. Now, you'll probably notice I keep saying the northern hemisphere. That's not just because we live in the northern hemisphere and we like to only think about ourselves. The fact is that if we look at the northern hemisphere, this is a map of the northern hemisphere here. This is the equator. You'll notice that the majority of land falls above this sort of imaginary line I'm drawing here. So when all of those terrestrial plants start to bloom during the northern hemisphere spring and summer, this is when we start to see that large drawdown in CO2. So this is why the patterns follow the seasonal changes in the northern hemisphere. Now hopefully this will work. This is a NASA image that they've compiled where you can see the seasonal changes. So this is summer in the southern hemisphere, summer in the northern hemisphere. Summer in the southern hemisphere, southern in the northern hemisphere. And what you should notice is not only are we getting a lot of growth on land the land masses during the northern hemisphere's spring, but we're also seeing changes in the ocean. And that's because we see the phytoplankton blooming during that time period. Okay, so those who are maybe skeptical of what I'm telling you right now, probably saying, okay, but let's be honest, this is a natural cycle that happens on Earth. And that's completely true. I'm not going to tell you it's not. The natural cycle of our Earth is that we experience highs in CO2 and lows in CO2. And that fluctuates. This is a graph going back, the CO2 data from present day to 800,000 years ago. Excuse me. And this is from ice bubble data, where they've actually sampled ice from very, very deep within the Antarctic ice sheet. They can look at the concentration of CO2 in those bubbles that were formed thousands and hundreds of thousands of years ago. So you'll see this very nice oscillation. We have highs, we have lows. We have highs, we have lows. What you should notice that this is our present day value. So not only have we exceeded the previous highs by about 100 parts per million, but this change has happened in 150 years, rather than 20,000 or 30,000 that it previously has happened in. So these changes in the past, which are perfectly natural and part of Earth's cycle, have happened over a much larger time period. And that's why the CO2 change that we're seeing is so alarming. In fact, you would have to go back over 2 million years to find a time when the Earth experienced CO2 at the present level it's currently experiencing. Okay, and again, that change was over a long, long time period. So what happens to all this extra CO2 that we are adding into the atmosphere? Well, about 1/3 of it, anywhere from 25 to 40% are the current estimates, is being absorbed by the ocean. The rest of it stays in the atmosphere. So obviously we could go on a huge tangent of what the extra atmospheric CO2 does to the Earth. But I'm here to talk about ocean acidification, so we're going to jump right into that. Now, I'm also going to try very hard not to go into too much chemistry, because generally when people talk about chemistry, that's the point when I stop listening. So I'm going to try and make this as simple as possible, because that's the way I would like to hear it if I were in your shoes. So we know, I just told you, so we know that the ocean is absorbing about 1/3 of all the human-released CO2 in our atmosphere. As that CO2 enters into the seawater, it reacts with the seawater and it forms carbonic acid. And carbonic acid should be a hint, because it's got the word acid in it, that this is now making the seawater ever so slightly more acidic. Very, very slightly. But as we start to change the acidity of the seawater, we're now depleting the carbonate ions. Now, I don't know if you remember me telling you, but calcium carbonate is what shells and skeletons of corals are made out of. So if we deplete the carbonate ions that are available in the water, it makes organisms that need to make their shells, it makes them have a harder time. They have a more difficult time forming their shells, because now there's less carbonate available to them. Now, the pH scale goes from 0 to 14. 7 is neutral on the pH scale. Anything less than 7 is considered acidic. Anything greater than 7 is considered basic. Seawater is basic. So it's right here at about 8.2 for the global average. So as we add more acid to the seawater, as we increase the acidity, we're pushing the seawater close to neutral. But it's becoming more acidic, hence the term acidification. But it's important to remember that the pH scale is logarithmic. So these changes are multiplicative. They're exponentially increasing the acidity every small increment of change. So if the seawater starts out at 8.2 pH and goes down to 7.9, this is a 100% change in the acidity of the water. And we know that this is CO2 induced, not some other sort of process that's happening in the ocean. Because if we go back to our handy little map that goes back to 800,000 years ago, we see the pink line here is tracking the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. And these little blue dots that you hopefully can see from the back are the pH. So pH and CO2 track very nicely together. And if we look at the global pH values all around the world, with these bluish colors being more acidic, red being more basic, you see that there's a lot of variation. You see over here where there's a lot of upwelling off the coast of South America, it's already more acidic. Areas where there's a heavy phytoplankton bloom, it's more basic. But the point is that the pH is naturally variable all around the globe. As a global average, the oceanic pH is 8.2. The projected decrease in the pH by the year 2100, assuming that we change absolutely nothing about the way that we're using our fossil fuels and emitting carbon, we're projected to hit around 7.8. And while that doesn't seem like much, it's a 150% increase in the acidity of the ocean. So does this change actually matter? Right? This is what everybody wants to know. And as humans, I'm not entirely sure that we would ever notice it. It's not going to be like that scene in Dante's Peak that hopefully will play, where the grandmother gets into the acid lake and tries to save everybody. This is not going to be the oceans, right? But if you're an organism that lives in the ocean and needs to make a shell, this will matter to you. Because this is going to make your day-to-day activities very difficult. Because if you don't have a skeleton, your life is going to be very tricky. So, ocean acidification is tipping the balance because it's making it harder for corals to form their skeletons. And we know this. There's been a massive quantity of studies looking at coral growth under different ocean acidification scenarios. This is just one that I like because it's got pretty pictures and the arrows fall very nicely evenly together. But you can see these two different coral species and also a coralline algae, which is also very important for the reef. If you expose them to decreasing pH, you see that their growth rate, their percent growth, decreases in a very linear fashion. So it's safe to say that ocean acidification is reducing coral growth, but what it's also doing is weakening the existing structures. So yes, corals may not be able to grow that fast, but what's still out there right now and already formed is going to start weakening. It's going to start dissolving, and this makes it more susceptible to bioerosion. Jane Lubchenco, who is formerly the Undersecretary of Science, I think, at NOAA, has likened it to an osteoporosis of the sea. Just like your bone density will start to weaken, it becomes more susceptible to breakage and other issues. This is the same thing that's happening to the skeletons in the ocean. So my question is, how will the bioerosion aspect be affected by acidification? Many, many other studies have looked at the coral growth aspect. Very few people have started to really look into the bioerosion aspect because it's just now starting to click with everybody that this is something we need to start investigating. So for part of my dissertation research here at Stony Brook, I went down to the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute in Bocas del Toro, Panama, and yes, that is a sloth. I took this picture. This should probably be their magazine cover. And for those of you who aren't really familiar with Panama, Panama Canal is right about here-ish. Where I was working is up here near Costa Rica in the Bocas del Toro region. So I was on the Caribbean side of Panama. This is the Pacific over here. And I was looking at, we're going to bring it back to the boring sponges now. I was looking at this species of boring sponge. It's Cliona varians, for those of you who are interested. And this species of coral, Porites furcata. And these two are commonly interacting on the reef. So this boring sponge will overgrow this coral, oftentimes directly. And as it overgrows the coral, it will also start to erode the coral skeleton below it. So it's eating away at the coral skeleton, as you see here. This is the sponge, and these are the fragments of coral sticking up. And this sponge is eroding all the coral that's beneath of it. So I wanted to know what happens to the sponge and also the coral when you change the acidity of the water. This is a very quick little study that I did in Panama. I say quick, but it's not that quick. This is a graph of coral growth. So if you're above this line here, it means you're a coral and you're growing. If you're below it, you're not growing, you're starting to dissolve. And this is ambient, so today's CO2 levels. And then this is the level, this last column here, is the level projected by the year 2100. So if we just look at the corals, we see that, yes, it's starting to decrease the growth, but they're still, for the most part, able to grow a little bit, just maybe not as quickly as before. But when we look at what happens when we also add the sponge and introduce the sponge with the coral, so now we've got the issue of, is the coral going to grow slower, and will the sponge erode faster? We see that this is very obvious. We go from a situation today where when we have a bioeroder, it's slightly less growth, but it's still growing. That's healthy, right? We have more carbonate being formed than being removed, to a situation in the future where we're seeing only dissolution. So this coral doesn't even have a fighting chance because it's being eroded faster than it can grow. And we did this really cool thing, I apologize, these are a little bit small, where we looked at those corals. After the experiment was over, we pulled them out, and we took them, we bleached them, sorry guys, and then we looked at them under a special scanning electron microscope so we could see the structure of the coral. This is the coral where the little arrow's pointing to where the sponge was. This is where the sponge was over on the skeleton using that scanning electron microscope. Now, this is today's value. There's nothing really going on here. So this is what the coral naturally looks like. It's got these little pores in it naturally. When a sponge starts to erode, what it does is it secretes a very weak acid and then takes an ice cream scoop chip out of the coral. So you'll see in this middle one, this is the moderate acidification projected for mid-century. You can start to see that there's these tiny little chip marks taken out where that sponge is starting to be better at eroding. But now I'm going to show you the high acidification level, and I want you to notice that not only is there massive chunks missing from the coral, but you see this little ice cream scoop environment here, where the sponge is really going to town and eroding that section of the coral. Okay, so what about temperature? I did not, in that study I just showed you, even consider the possibility that the temperature is going to change. However, we know that that's not true. As we increase the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, we're causing a very small change in the global temperatures. So while this doesn't seem like much, for a coral this is a big deal because corals will only grow between certain temperatures. And if you get past that upper level of temperature, the coral will not grow, or it will grow much slower and less efficiently. So we know that elevated temperatures will slow coral growth, and if you elevate those temperatures to such an extreme, we can actually see coral bleaching, where the corals lose an association with these small little algae that live inside their cells that is vital to their existence. Once corals bleach, they have about a 90% chance of dying. So if you elevate temperatures too high, you're actually going to kill them. You're not just going to slow their growth. So I wanted to include temperature in a very similar study to the one I just showed you. I obviously had to magnify it quite a bit. So I've become somewhat of a plumber myself with all of these various experiments that I've run. But I was able to use 3 different levels of acidification. These are the pH values. I used 2 different temperatures. The normal temperature for that area of Panama, which is the yearly average, or the seasonal average at the time I was working. And then I increased it by just 1 degree Celsius, which is not much of a change. I didn't want to kill it, so I changed it ever so slightly. The projected increase for the tropics, however, is close to 2 or 3 degrees. So this is actually a very modest change in temperature. And then I exposed the corals to either a sponge bioeroder or no sponge at all and just let them be corals. So I had a total of 144 tanks in this experiment, and each of the tanks had 7 living corals and 3 dead corals. Now, all of these tanks in my experiment underwent 4 weeks of very, very slow acclimation, where I slowly brought them up to the full treatment conditions, and then 16 weeks of experimental conditions. Now, the reason I took 4 weeks to acclimate them is because you can imagine if you're a coral and a sponge, and all of a sudden you're placed in drastically different and altered environmental conditions, what I'm going to measure from you is really just going to be shock rather than your actual response. So by using an acclimation period, over 4 weeks I can slowly get them used to the conditions that I'm going to be testing them in, so that I'm not just merely seeing their instant reaction and shock to the new environment, but really see how they're reacting as we change their environmental conditions. Okay, so, excuse me. So first I'm going to talk about what happened with the dead coral. Dead coral was never alive. It was placed into the experiment dead. I just wanted to see if you have bare substrate, bare coral with nothing going on, what would happen. And not surprisingly, this little dotted line here is 0, right? Because they should not be growing, they're dead. So we should only see them dissolve. Not surprisingly, you start to see all these corals, whether they're in today's temperature or higher temperature. As we increase the acidity, they start to dissolve more. When we add a sponge bioeroder, you might think, well, the sponge is definitely going to decrease them even further. But in fact, that's not what happened, because as it turns out, even whenever the sponge was actively eroding these corals, the major driver in this dissolution was the acidification. So if you have bare coral substrate or bare limestone, it doesn't matter what's going on if there's a bioeroder or not, because the sheer acidity of the environment is going to cause it to dissolve and weaken it. So now let's think about the living coral. This is the living coral here with this cute little sponge attached to it. So if we just look at the living coral, and again, this is the same setup. So this box up here is today's temperature. This is elevated temperature. We have today's pH values and increasing acidity as we move this way. This is measuring coral growth. And this 0 line here, what you should notice is that all of these, despite the high acidity and the high temperature, are still above 0. So that's great. These corals are still able to grow despite these terrible acidification and temperature environments. So that's a plus side, right? Now whenever we add the sponges, however, I should say, there is a difference between the different temperatures. So as you increase the temperatures, these are lower. When you add the sponge, you see that the variation begins to get a little bit bigger, and they do start to decrease slightly. So we are seeing an effective sponge. So the take home from this is that the higher temperatures are going to slow coral growth, and the sponge bioerosion will start to remove more of the coral skeleton. But in this case, for this coral species, acidification did not slow the coral growth. Okay, so I should also say I looked at a bunch of different things. I'm not presenting all of that right now. But the difference in the attachment rates was non-existent. So the sponges, whether they were in a higher temperature or higher acidification environment, attached to the corals at the same rate. So this suggests that in the future, there will be no change in the way that these two species interact. Okay, so I'm going to remind you here about all the different aspects of bioerosion on coral reefs. I was just looking at this boring sponge, but as I told you, boring sponges are the #1 bioeroder on reefs. However, they're not the only bioeroder. So what I wanted to do was look at a community of bioeroders and see whether or not that changed, because simply looking at one organism or one type of animal is not going to give you the whole picture. So I went out and I collected coral rubble. These are a bunch of different pieces of coral rubble. These are my little tags, so I knew which one was which. They did not have names. All of these coral rubble had one thing in common. They were already dead coral pieces, so as the coral pieces broke off of the reef naturally, these guys just fell to the floor. They were then infested naturally by all these different bioeroders. You'll see these little black dots. These are all sponges. So these are all different boring sponges. But there's also different worms in here. There's boring algae. Believe it or not, there's algae that bore. And there's a couple other different organisms living inside of these. What I wanted to know was, how does this whole community of bioeroding organisms react to acidification? Will it react the same way that just the sponge does, or is it a little bit different whenever you look at the community? And what I found was that, in fact, it is not different. So this is today's value of acidification. This is the year 2100 acidification. And this is the dissolution rate. So this is almost double the dissolution rate. So when we look at the bioeroding community as a whole, I found that it's going to dissolve the limestone rock, this is non-living coral, twice as fast as it currently does. Okay, so what does this all mean? I'm up here blabbering on about how much I love sponges and how much bioerosion is going to increase in the future, and how doom and gloom everything is, right? But what does this mean for our reefs? Well, as I've said, it's simple economics. So today, we're in a position where most reefs are experiencing net growth. This means that the growth is greater than the removal processes of bioerosion. However, when you add acidification and warming, we see that rather than having net growth, we now shift to net loss. So we're going to slowly start to decrease the actual aerial coverage of coral reefs as they start to erode. Even if some species are growing, the bioerosion is going to outpace that growth. So this means that coral reefs are going to be less structurally resilient when they're faced with storms. Right now, corals are very strong. As a storm passes over them, they can absorb much of that wave energy. They do not merely collapse in the face of a storm. But as you start to weaken their skeletal structure and increase the amount of bioerosion, just like our bones under osteoporosis, these are going to collapse. Similarly, we can compare it to natural forest changes. This is a picture of Mount St. Helens in 1980, and this is Mount St. Helens in 2015. So once these corals are destroyed, like this forest here, it's going to take them a very long time to come back to something that we may recognize as functional. This is a 35-year change in the forest, and we still haven't seen recovery. Corals grow even slower than trees do. So it should not really surprise you that this presents a problem, because as you can imagine, a reef that looks like this, with this beautiful structure and great integrity, is going to be far more economically, but also ecologically valuable than something that looks like this. So what does this all mean? It means that coral reefs, as we know them, are going to change. What we think of as coral reefs today are not going to be the coral reefs that your grandchildren think of. This is sort of a recreation using different reefs around the world currently, where we have reefs that are beautiful, pristine, with lots of fish. And as we increase the amount of CO2 in the water and the acidity level of the water, we see them shift from something very nice and pristine like this to something that has a lot of algae and starts to have less coral. And then finally we get to something that's unrecognizable as a coral reef to what we normally think of. So it's always kind of hard for me to give this talk because I feel like it's very depressing. And everybody's kind of sitting here like, ugh, so we've ruined everything, right? But while I think it's very important that we should be actively concerned about the coral reefs and what we're doing to them, I do think it's important to leave with a positive note so that you have something to look forward to, maybe. And I wanted to leave you with some maybe positive sides of things. Remember this graph that I showed you where I told you that none of the corals were impacted and they were still growing even though they were subjected to high temperatures and high CO2. This is not unusual. There are many species that are not going to be as negatively impacted. So some species are going to be very sensitive, whereas other species are going to be more resilient. I purposely chose this coral species because it is a more resilient species. I figured if this species was going to show any sort of damage, then we were really you-know-what. So this is a positive thing, that some of the species may not be as impacted as others. In fact, even those species that are very sensitive, this is a species from Hawaii, this is what it normally looks like. This is what it looks like whenever you've grown it in a pH of 7.4, which is extremely acidic, for 12 months. And you see that what's the difference here is that this no longer has that hard skeletal structure, but the polyps are still there and still growing. And once you take this guy here and put it back into normal seawater, it starts to regrow. So while even the most sensitive species are going to be affected by acidification, there is hope that if we start to reverse this cycle and reverse the impact of acidification, some of these species may come back. There's also the thought that if we have habitats near each other, they can actually help each other out. This is seagrass here. Seagrass is a plant, and as a plant, it photosynthesizes. So it is going to be drawing down CO2 from the seawater. As it pulls that CO2 out of the seawater, it's actually making the water around it less acidic. So if you have corals next to a habitat like this may be a small refuge for it. Now, obviously, this isn't going to save all the coral reefs in the world, but we may see some resiliency in areas where there's close coupling of different habitats, which really means that rather than considering this just a coral reef problem, we should consider this a global habitat problem and work to conserve all the different habitats. So there is still hope. But this is everybody's responsibility. So it's not just a country's responsibility. It's not just your government's responsibility. This is sort of everyone in the room can do something, whether it's reduce your own fossil footprint or carbon footprint, reuse, recycle more often. Everybody can take steps to reduce the carbon emitted into the atmosphere, which is the only way that we're going to be able to change any of this. And with that, I would like to thank my advisor, Brad Peterson. Also, very heavily, a big help in my research is Brad Furman, who's not here. He's down in Florida for his postdoc. These two were immensely helpful during my research. I also need to thank the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian Institute, through 2 different fellowships, funded all of this research. And of course, you can imagine that with 144 tanks and 10 corals in each of them, there were lots of corals to process. So I had many undergraduates from Stony Brook, as well as some of the graduate students in my lab help me with the processing of, you can see this is Brad here after a very long day in the office. Help me with various aspects of this. And this is sort of a summary of all students and staff that have helped me in funding agencies throughout the time in my entire, we won't say how many years, of my PhD. And with that, I'll take any questions. Yes?
Go back to maybe the first or second slide where you show the economic impact
Sure.
on the different countries and continents and how it will affect their economies if nothing is done. I know we had this conference in Paris this past week about climate change, and do you think that this was a topic that was discussed?
Yes. So it'll pop up in a minute. Oh, I have to. Is it this one that you wanted,
Yes.
or this one?
No, the one before. It shows you the dollar value.
Yes. So
The impact to the economies of the
Yes.
different countries.
So this is, you'll notice that the highest value here is in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia, a lot of little countries. We have the Philippines, Indonesia, Micronesia. Unfortunately, a lot of those little countries don't tend to have as large of a power whenever they're in these large multi-country talks. However, I know I follow a forum where they discuss these things, the Coral Listserv with NOAA, and I know that this issue, the coral reef protection, is one of the main issues with many of the climate change talks that are going on. Because, as I showed you, ocean acidification is a problem, but you'll remember that temperature was also a really big issue as well. So it's kind of a 2-part hit to coral reefs. And of course, who knows what's going to happen with the talks, but...
So where does China come in?
So I think that they're encompassed in the Southeast Asia area. Yeah, because I don't see them being distinct as their own separate area.
Because they will play a big role because they are carbon emissions because of the coal they're burning.
Yeah.
And the question is whether or not that will impact and slow their economy.
I mean,
what point?
Right. Well, the problem is that large countries like China, I don't need to get all political right now, but bigger countries like that have other resources they can fall back onto. So there are countries in the Pacific that may only get income or income from outside of their country from people coming in for tourism reasons and fisheries. Whereas China obviously has other industries that they are getting their wealth from. So the
They're
percent...
investing in the U.S. now.
What's that?
They're investing in the U.S. They're buying property and...
But, so a lot of the nations that really should be concerned are sort of these smaller nations that unfortunately get the majority of their income from coral reefs or some aspect of coral reefs, and they're probably not represented as well as they could be. Yeah?
I know you said that the current atmospheric carbon dioxide is about 400 parts per million.
Uh-huh.
I believe I saw on your slide that the ocean is currently 375 parts per million. Is that correct?
It varies in so it's completely varied all over the globe, but do you have more of that question?
No,
Okay, so the actual CO2 in the ocean is generally going to be less than what's in the atmosphere because the exchange in the open ocean is going to be less because of the exchange between the atmosphere and the ocean may not be as efficient, as quick. However, in areas like estuaries, shallow water areas where there's other processes besides the atmosphere that increase CO2, so like in our estuaries here, we have breakdown of biological materials. So seagrass leaves break down, they're releasing CO2. Different processes that are going on in the sediments are releasing CO2. So you can actually have much, much higher levels of CO2 in areas that are sort of shallow and near the coastline. Most of the ocean acidification values are an average, and so because the open ocean is so much larger, they tend to represent the open ocean. Yes?
What was responsible for all those periodic increases in carbon dioxide over the last couple 100,000 years?
Oh man, I feel like I'm back in my comprehensive exams right now. It's a difference between ice ages and not ice ages. So they're, for the most part, the glacial periods and not glacial periods. Because whenever you can imagine, if you have a glacial period and half the Earth is covered in ice, you're also going to block out, you're going to be reflecting a lot of the sunlight back. Oh, this gets complicated. I'm sorry. But the fact is that the different ice ages are going to flip back and forth. So the Earth naturally goes from one ice age to a non-ice age, to ice age to ice. It flips back and forth. And it's a cycle that happens naturally, usually on the scale of 100 or so thousands of years, anywhere from 10,000 to 100-something thousand years. And then it resets itself through different feedback mechanisms. I can explain it more, but it's going to make me sweat a lot. Yeah.
Is much of this data actually collected with aerial surveys?
Which data do you mean?
Just measuring the size of the reefs and maybe to differentiate bleach coral with non-bleach coral rather than snorkeling around to get a survey. I know that one member of the Marine Science Department's area of specialty is aerial surveys and stuff like that.
Yeah, so a lot of the data that I was showing you as sort of a summary of coral reefs is a conglomeration of data that's sort of been analyzed as a huge data set and brought together. So some of that may be different methods that they take and they sort of even it out so that they're on an even playing field when they're comparing different studies and they get an idea of what's happening. A lot of the stuff is aerial, but not always can you tell truly the extent of bleaching from an aerial because, of course, these, if you look at this reef, if you were to look just at the top down, you would miss any bleaching that's happening sort of in this sort of infrastructure area that's a little bit more complex. So a lot of these are very quick surveys, but then they're generally ground truths by having somebody come in and say, okay, this is definitely, 90% of it has bleached. Yes?
Atmospheric CO2, is that measured at sea level or any particular elevation?
Well, so the graph that I showed you, where it's this nice little, the high increase, is measured at the top of Mauna Loa in Hawaii. And at the top of Mauna, now I'm never going to find it. The top of Mauna Loa, did I pass it?
There it is.
Okay, so this is at the Mauna Loa station run in the middle of the Pacific. And they chose this station because it's at a very high elevation and there's not a lot of human impact around it. So if you were to measure this in the middle of the United States, you would have a lot of local pollution impacting it. So they chose the middle of the Pacific with not a lot going on as their measuring point. There's other areas around the globe that they do this as well. This one is just the longest running data set. So this is sort of the graph du jour that everybody likes to show. Yes, Steve?
Some of the studies done with bivalves have shown that when you have elevated food levels, it actually helps mitigate the effects of the acidification. Is there any evidence for that with corals?
It is. There is. So there's been a couple studies more recently that have shown if a coral has a heavy amount of lipids, so it's got a lot of fat, it's got a lot of fat reserves, it's able to deal with stresses a lot easier because it no longer is spending as much energy. If you're an animal, you spend energy on a couple different things, right? Your basic metabolic growth, reproduction, and what's the other one? Now I'm nervous right now.
Growth, reproduction, and basal metabolic activity.
Oh, and growth, yeah, that's what I missed. So maintaining yourself, growing, and also reproducing. So if you don't have to maintain yourself, because you've already got a heavy amount of lipid reserves, you could spend more time sort of ameliorating this stressful environment. You have a little bit more oomph to get you through it, right? So there is some evidence that this is true with corals, but the question is, I mean, how long will that last for? Will it get you through a year? I don't know. So the time scale is important on studies like that, because of course, if you're very fat as a coral, you will use those reserves very quickly, and then where are you at? Yeah?
Based on that question, has there been any work looking at reproductive output and how it's affected by ocean acidification of corals?
There has the output, so most of the work looking at reproduction has focused more on what happens when the baby is exposed to the different temperatures. So if you're a tiny coral larvae, are you going to be more affected than an adult? But they are starting to look at reproduction itself, and they're finding that reproductive output is also reduced because the coral is now trying very desperately to just maintain itself and grow, so it has very little energy to allocate toward reproducing. However, that being said, there are some species that rather than try and maintain themselves, just say to hell with it, I'm going to now reproduce because this is my only shot. So it goes both ways. But once you reproduce and the water is terrible, I mean, where do you go from there? Yeah?
Did you mention the effects of acidification on the symbiotic algae, or is it just the fact that their house is being destroyed and
Well,
they're just released?
okay, so this is a part of my study that I did not present. So Howie's asking, the corals have zooxanthellae within them. They're an algae that lives inside of them and provides a benefit both to the coral and also the algae themselves benefit from living inside the coral tissue. In the study that I did, I looked at the algae, so I tried to see whether or not the algae was increasing, but also whether or not it was photosynthesizing more. And it turns out that the algae within the coral actually like the acidification because you've increased the CO2 available to them. So even though the coral may not have, so it may not respond positively to acidification, the algae is a plant, and so it doesn't mind it so much. And there's some thought that this may also help with different coral species, because if the zooxanthellae within the corals do better, it's going to help the coral out by giving the coral more food. So it's very complicated. These studies are just sort of, you know, we just started realizing that acidification is a problem. So we're in the infant years of this, so we're starting to move on to the toddler years, but we haven't really started to look at these very complex interactions yet. Yeah?
Do you see a correlation with the effects of acidification on the surface area of different species of coral, such as rain coral having a much lower effect, the effects of rain coral having a lower surface area than branching corals? Is there any evidence to that effect?
I'm not sure that anybody's done a study looking specifically at surface area, but there have been studies looking at the density. So a brain coral is the large mounding coral. They tend to be much denser than a branching coral. They're in general sort of a little bit more, they're less dense. And the density does matter because the more dense it is, the slower they start to dissolve. But that's an interesting question. And a lot of the studies have started looking at the internal mechanisms for coral calcification. So they've started looking at not the pH just in the environment, but the pH on the inside of the coral, because many corals purposely change the pH inside so that it's benefiting them to calcify. So if I have an internal calcification region somewhere near what currently is the environmental pH, I'm going to do better than something that has to really raise it higher than what's already out there. So there's some different ways of looking at this, but I don't think anybody's done surface area itself.
Is there one last question? Oh, over there, Keith.
No.
I'm just wondering if you're aware of any studies that when bleaching has occurred and the coral doesn't die and it is re-inoculated with new zooxanthellae, that the zooxanthellae are adapted for more higher optimal temperatures?
Yeah,
so would that then protect them from future, at the same temperature they may be
Yeah, so that's sort of old. So yes, the answer is yes. They've done studies where they've looked at the zooxanthellae corals, and they found that there's a couple different species or clades of zooxanthellae, and some of those species or clades are more resistant to higher temperatures. So those corals that don't end up bleaching generally have or are reinfested by zooxanthellae tend to have the zooxanthellae that are better at dealing with higher temperatures. But that doesn't. So that's only speaking toward temperature, not so much acidification. There's some interest in looking at whether certain zooxanthellae are better at dealing with more CO2, so they maybe can take advantage of it even more. But there's been very little work done with that. Again, it's kind of like everybody's just now getting into this.
Well, I'm sure that Amber would welcome answering any of your questions if you want to come up and ask them to her. But let's thank Dr. Stubler for her presentation.
And if you're in my class, make sure I see you so I can give you extra credit. Do you need to take this back?
I think so.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm curious about the diadema population of sea urchins. Have they come back now?
So,